All right. So, good afternoon and welcome to our fourth and final webinar. The theme of today's webinar will be the EU abroad, and it'll cover part 4 of the course, which addressed some of the main functional and geographical themes in EU foreign policy or in European foreign policy. We covered EU-Russia relations. Then we also covered the EU's doings in its immediate neighborhood, with a particular emphasis on the eastern neighborhood, which of course is very timely nowadays. And we also covered energy security and international environmental policy, and from an EU perspective, of course. Unfortunately, Ambassador Otte could not come to deliver the lecture on trade, so I apologize for that again. And then we ended by sort of zooming out of EU foreign policy and looking at the European integration process from a broader geopolitical lens, and hypothesizing, or rather fantasizing, about Europe's possible futures. That was the last lecture by yours truly. Today we're going to summarize some of the main points made during the lectures of part 4. Some of the lectures and try and think of the broader implications of the respective topics we're going to cover. We're going to start with Dr. Svetlana Kopsar. She's going to start with a presentation on the main points covered during her lecture on the Eastern Neighborhood and the Eastern Partnership. As already discussed, this remains a very hot and a very timely topic, of course. And given that Svetlana is an expert on Ukraine and has been involved in many policy discussions on Ukraine, you may want to take this last opportunity to ask her about the evolving situation there and its implications for the European Union. We will then continue with Dr. Katya Birenkov's presentation on energy security and environment. And of course, Svetlana's and Katya's themes are very much intertwined, because you all know that energy is a key part of the game in Eastern Europe. And to wrap up after Katya's lectures presentation, I will summarize the main points made during my lecture on Europe's futures. Now, each presentation will take about 10, 15 to 20 minutes, even maybe. Which means we should have plenty of time for discussing any comments or questions you may have. Now, Svetlana is going to go first, and she will have to leave shortly after her presentation, which means that any questions you may have on the first segment, that is on Svetlana's presentation, you may want to ask them either during the presentation. Well, you may want to use the iChat, the chat during the presentation, or ask questions. We'll leave some few minutes after a presentation for any questions or comments you may have on that topic, and then we'll move on to Katya and my presentation, and then we'll have some more space for any questions you may have. All right, so Svetlana, over to you when you want. You can get started.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to do this webinar, and also for giving me a chance to do the lecture. I really enjoyed interacting with students, and I always learn a lot also from students in this process. As Liz mentioned, I'm also have been involved a lot in Ukraine, and I'm Ukrainian by origin, but have been abroad for 15 years. I don't think it feels abroad anymore. Just to give you a small snapshot of my background, maybe it also kind of demonstrates the experiences that I bring to this debate. So I've lived in Ukraine for 15 years, and then I went to the US and spent some time there. I was a kind of product of the Soft Power Future Leaders Exchange Scholarship. I spent there 6 years, and then went to the UK, spent there 7 years, and I've been there after that for several years now in Belgium, in Brussels. So actually, I remember following the debates of the beginning of the European Neighborhood Policy, which I will begin with, kind of giving you an overview, a really brief overview of the European Neighborhood Policy, but then focusing on Eastern Partnership and Ukraine. So I actually remember the time when the Orange Revolution in Ukraine happened, and also during that same time there was around the same time there was enlargement taking place, and the EU was really grappling with the idea of what to do with countries like Ukraine, who were not on EU membership kind of list of prospect. But at the same time, it's an important country, bordering EU and European country. So the European Neighborhood Policy was in a way an almost ad hoc decision to use similar tools that were used for enlargement, but extend them to the neighbors, and that would work. But the neighborhood policy itself became kind of a wide-reaching program. So it includes 16 EU's closest neighbors. Just to list: Algeria, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Egypt, Georgia, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Libya, Moldova, Morocco, Palestine, Syria, Tunisia, and Ukraine. So it has actually lots of different diverse group of countries. One thing they do share in common is that their proximity, so to speak, to the EU. But of course they involve many different issues. As a result of this diversity of countries, increasingly over the years, after the neighborhood policy has been launched, there's been a call for greater diversification. And that went along with also calls for regional integration, so for the EU to promote regional formation and regional collaboration among these countries. And also, thirdly, there is different competing priorities among EU member states. So for Poland, for example, Ukraine was much more important. For Spain, it was North African neighbors were much more important. So also this kind of push for regionalization, but also the greater focus on recognizing diversity of EU member states, created different groups. In 2009 in Prague, we had Eastern Partnership launched, and at the same time we also had the Union for the Mediterranean, the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, formerly known as the Barcelona Process, relaunched in Paris in July 2008. So around the same time frame, we had these different kind of regional groupings. And the Black Sea Synergy was also launched in Kiev in February 2008. So we see several themes that the European Neighborhood Policy aimed to achieve. So it was kind of an ambitious in its rhetoric, in a sense it wanted to promote common values, democracy, human rights, rule of law, good governance, market economy, as well as sustainable development. So it's quite an ambitious mix considering diversity of countries. And it tried to do it in different ways. In fact, in 2010 and 2011, they focused on promotion of deep and sustainable democracy, combined with economic development, has been one of the core pillars of the European Neighborhood Policy, and it did so by trying to implement these rhetoric in the action plans. It had 12 so far agreed bilateral action plans, and action plans basically had short and medium-term priorities from 3 to 5 years that then try to put concretely the correct set of indicators and goals to pursue. At the same time, the EU has worked in collaboration with other financial institutions to provide grants and loans. So we had the European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, as well as the EU itself provided a combination of grants for implementation, but also loans through these institutions. There was also a greater call throughout the process of EU neighborhood policy, since one of the core pillars was the democracy promotion element, was for creation a facility for civil society involvement, because after all it was mainly government to government, and especially in bilateral relationship. And so the civil society facility and civil society forum has been established, and each time now, for example, in the Eastern Partnership Summit, there's also a civil society forum that takes place. So if you want to check on the progress of the Eastern Partnership and the European Neighborhood Policy, in particular Eastern Partnership, you can, of course, watch the news and think that it's all doomed, considering current events. But at the same time, you can also read the 12 progress reports that has been recently released, and 2 regional reports. And just to sum up, in terms of the interesting factual things, at least that the Commission highlights, the kind of 3 interesting facts before I jump into the analysis and interpretation of the progress so far. In 2011, the EU and EP partner trade was worth 230 billion. So it's quite a large number if we compare from the onset. Also, EU provided 12 billion in grant money from 2007 to 2013 to ENP countries. It's a large number, but actually If you also compare recent financial package to Ukraine, EU has managed to come up with 11 billion as well. So Ukraine crisis has been actually quite important if we compare financially the allocation of funds for all EU neighborhood policy and then recently to Ukraine. And EU issued 3.2 million Schengen visas to ENP countries in 2012. But there's been lots of different frameworks and details, policy frameworks within the European neighborhood policy, people-to-people contacts, negotiations of readmission agreements, and the implication it has on different internal and external security policies. I'm not going to go into details because it's a mixed record. But as was mentioned in the introduction to this webinar, the Ukrainian crisis has created a platform for questioning, asking hard questions. Has the policy worked? Has it not worked? Of course, we also had the Arab Spring, which also facilitated discussion and reflection on the progress of the EU and what the EU can do. But at that time, the EU has been really preoccupied with with the financial crisis. So if we look back at the foreign policy crisis has traditionally provided an opportunity to change something. If we look at the Balkan wars or at the kind of major crises where EU had to look in the mirror and think how it did. It's really, if things didn't go that too well, it also facilitated the opportunity to create, for example, common foreign security policy. So it's an interesting time in terms of Ukraine because it's a lot of concerns about what is happening, but at the same time, I believe it provides opportunity. The timing works. You have crisis in Ukraine and you have new EU leadership coming in shortly. We have to really watch the space as to whether there's going to be any substantial change. But before we jump into that, let me quickly then tell you my interpretation of events also in Ukraine, since I've been following them quite closely from the very beginning. I think when I talk to policymakers, there are different groups of interpretation of the EU role and what happens in Ukraine. Some say that it was wrong maybe to have this association agreement offered to Ukraine. As you recall, Ukraine, along with Georgia and Moldova, was really ready to sign the association agreement. Ukraine was ready to actually sign, whereas Moldova and Georgia initialed the agreements in Vilnius in the fall. But because Yanukovych refused to sign, we saw a lot of people coming and take it to the streets, and the events escalated to the point that there was a Euromaidan revolution that resulted in Yanukovych also fleeing. And the interpretation of that and the EU role and Russia's role really then dictates what is the future for this relationship and for the European Eastern Partnership per se. Some say, as I mentioned, that it was wrong for Europe to offer maybe association agreement, that it was too ambitious, they didn't consider Russia's interest, and in a sense that really caused the crisis. And in fact, it was kind of a dominant discourse that Russia pursued, that Ukraine is too complicated, it's really important to Russia. Europe, the EU and US don't get Ukraine, it's way too complicated for them. The EU should really consult first Russia before proceeding on the policy towards Ukraine. I disagree with that rhetoric because I really think that over the years, and my PhD has focused on EU-Ukraine relations, where I analyzed 1994 until 2004 and relationship with the EU. And over the years, Ukraine has had this multi-vector foreign policy, which basically meant that it tried to balance between EU and Russia. And it actually worked well, but you know whom it worked well for? It worked well for the oligarchs, and it worked well for elites, some in Ukraine, some in Russia, but it provided a kind of a roof for rent-seeking behavior of kind of creating their own sets of rules, calling it democracy, but then using different rules to interpret that term, calling it certain reforms, but not really implementing them. And I think it was because there wasn't really a strong commitment to roadmap to that Central Eastern countries had, that they had to fulfill in order to move to the next stage. The European neighborhood policy, and especially the partnership and cooperation agreement that existed before this association agreement was negotiated, it wasn't strong enough of a tool and incentive even to really lock these elites into the reform effort. And I think that it created an unsustainable governance environment where that governance model of rent-seeking behavior can work maybe in some countries, but in Ukraine, where the fairly vibrant civil society, it didn't become sustainable any longer. And what happened was a clash of systems that I see, a clash of governance system. One is the kind of post-Soviet system where oligarchy, corruption, can go on, and there's lack of freedom of press, intimidation, violence used against people if they speak up against. And the other one that I think many in Ukraine aspired, and in fact in July, polling was 62 of young, younger than 30 aspired, and 58 of older population, was the kind of what EU came to symbolize for Ukrainians, and that is more transparent governance model, deep-reaching economic reforms, higher standard of living, democracy, and rule of law. And I think that because of this clash in the system, that was the root cause, I think, of the crisis, because the governance wasn't sustainable any longer. And I think the kind of second major point is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, you had different countries in Central and Eastern Europe who are in different trajectory modes. And a lot of the kind of what caused the kind of dynamic of their different trajectory mode was their national identity, how formed their national identity was. If you look at Poland, they had a long dissident movement. But in Ukraine, the Soviet Union collapse didn't really register among the elites. You had 90% of Soviet elites who were still in government after Ukraine gained its independence. And I think that what is also happening now, in a sense, is Ukraine's attempt to break away from the Soviet Union past. But it's not that easy, of course. Ukraine is a different multicultural country. There are deep-rooted myths and there are deep-rooted identities within Ukraine, and therefore, and also a low standard of living, and it creates opportunities for different tensions, which I don't have time to go into great details, but just to give you an overall picture. I think it was also during the Euromaidan, there was some myths in the West that were promoted. One was that it was solely EU movement, so EU versus Russia movement. And also was a myth that it was mainly youth-driven movement. But in fact, I disagree with that interpretation. Because if we look at the data and the statistics, it wasn't EU versus Russia. It was about, again, different mode of governance. And EU happened to be the closest neighbor and the most accessible, different system of governance that Ukraine could move towards. It couldn't integrate with Latin America, it couldn't integrate with the US, or it couldn't integrate with China, so the EU happened to be the closest neighbor, which provided an alternative system of governance to that one that Russia provided at that time. So it wasn't necessarily anti-Russian, but it was just a different way that Ukraine wanted to pursue reforms. And at the same time, it wasn't anti-Russian because many in Russia also supported Euromaidan. Of course, not majority, and I think there is a strong correlation if we look at support of Russians towards the Euromaidan with the ones who watch also federal media. For example, the recent poll showed that 52% of Russians trust federal media, and 45% of Russians believe that Euromaidan was the product of Western secret services. But there are some in Russia who saw that this wasn't just a Russia versus Europe per se. It was more about the system of governance. In fact, in the beginning of the Euromaidan, there were 45% of Russians who stated that, let me find this quote. Actually, I don't, but they expressed their support for Euromaidan and stating that it's really freedom, there's a really search for human rights and freedom rather than kind of just simply Europe versus Russia. So it was much more deeper than that. I think it's important to really understand, I think, the roots of the crisis, and that's why I went slightly in discussion about that in order to see the role of the EU. In my vision, the EU was an important actor, but it wasn't really the cause of the crisis. And in fact, I think association agreement would actually allow Ukraine to pursue the reforms that it needs to pursue, and it would allow also to address many of the issues that Russia wants, in rhetoric for Ukraine to have, and it also would address concerns of many people in different regions. For example, deep-reaching decentralization program, establishment of rule of law, and economic reforms to contribute to the higher standard of living. I think no one from the east of Ukraine would mind those things. But from the European side of view, I think there still needs to be some reflection as to what to do with countries who want to become members, and how to provide greater differentiation. So, for example, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine are on a different track from Azerbaijan and Belarus. So is it really, and Armenia, so can we really have the same policy towards all members? But at the same time, how do you pursue that differentiation? So there's a more for more principle where Europe provides more if countries implement more, but what can be done in addition to that? That's the kind of question that many EU officials now are asking themselves, and will be really definitely one part of the policy debates. One of the some argue that the answer would be to focus on the policy areas rather than geographic proximity as a marker for finding the partners. So, for example, migration or trade or just kind of common interests would provide an avenue for finding neighbors, so to speak. As opposed to just whoever happens to be right next to Europe. I still think that geographic proximity is still a factor, because you can't really, your neighbor is just right there, and so you have issues maybe that are even further intensified, whether it's migration issues, for example, if it's a neighboring country, you're more likely to have an impact, or even other issues like even trade. Is geographic proximity is a convenient factor to have when you have closer economic relations. But again, this is an issue that we'll need to watch. I think I'll stop on that note just to leave room for questions. I'm happy to go in detail on, but to leave room for questions, I'm happy to stop at this point.
All right, people, I'm back. So if you have any questions for Svetlana, as we said, now is the time, because she's gonna have to leave us shortly. So unless you prove otherwise, I will assume that you have no questions or comments. That means everything was crystal clear. She left no room for doubt whatsoever, it's actually very encouraging, particularly with a topic like Ukraine. It's very good news. And then we will we'll move on to Katya. If you and any questions pop up on the whole Ukraine business, Eastern neighborhood theme, you'll still have a few minutes because she let us stick around for a couple more minutes. So without further ado, we'll hand it over to Dr. Bielkov.
Good day. I hope I'm not interrupting your lunch break too much. I'm taking over, and I think it was a very nice complimentary presentation by Svetlana. I was asked to talk about energy and climate security, and in class 2 weeks ago, I think, we didn't manage to cover this topic in almost 2 hours. So now the big challenge is to condense it even more into 10 or to 15 minutes. I'll do my best, but it means that I'll just scratch the surface, but you're free to either ask a question now or send me an email afterwards. So energy and climate security are two broad topics, and we'll focus a bit more on the energy part than the climate part. One first, why does my slide not work? Oh, yeah, okay, so now it works. Just to kind of make the point and underline why it actually is important that we talk about energy and climate in the context of security policy or security concerns. I brought a graph here which is taken from the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report of 2013. And basically what they've done is they asked business leaders what event they think is likely to occur, and if it occurs has a very high risk a very high impact on the global governance, on global risk. And I took the top right corner and zoomed in. So this one, next slide, is basically this top right corner of this graph. And if you look at that, you obviously see some of the classical security risks that you would assume: terrorism, failure to resolve conflicts, and these kind of topics, which of course are a big threat to global security. But if you look further, there are also climate-related risks, and they rank very high in the impact that they will likely have if they occur, but also in the likeliness that they will occur. Please keep in mind that's of course the assessment of a number of business leaders, and but nonetheless, I think quite indicative of for us to actually start worrying about these security concerns as well. And there's also actually an energy related. So extreme volatility in energy and agricultural prices is also one of the big risks that we should look at if we don't do so already. So this just to kind of make the point that it is a very important topic that should not be forgotten when talking about security policy. Zooming in on the EU energy policy very briefly to give you a background, since the Lisbon Treaty, it's actually explicit part of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. There's a new energy chapter which was not in previous treaties. So actually also the EU has tried to lift some energy policy competences to the EU level, but a lot still remains in the competence of the member states. Nonetheless, it is a sign that there's now this chapter which basically promotes solidarity between member states. So meaning there is some EU level policy making, but still a lot remains in the hands of the member states as well. And especially if you look at the second point, security of energy supply is a very important point that, especially now with the Ukraine topic on the table, has gained increasing political impetus, and we already heard about that. And also some of these processes are now subject to the ordinary legislative procedure, meaning qualified majority vote in the Council and the European Parliament being co-legislator. So that's also a relatively new development, and we'll see what the legislators actually will make out of it. But there are some developments already. Okay, moving to just give a brief overview of the EU's energy production and imports. And that's very important. The EU produces some energy, and you can see here the distribution of what kind of energy the EU produces itself, but we import a lot. And you can see here already the main imports that we conduct is oil and it's gas. And that's, as most of you will already know, that's where the problem or the security problem lies. If you look at this slide here, that shows you the energy import dependency of the EU. 27, Croatia was not in the EU in 2009 yet. So basically we see here that the EU has always been dependent on imports, but this has increased, and it has particularly increased in coal and gas. And gas is, of course, as most of you will know already, a big issue with regards to our relations with Russia at the moment. If we look at that in a more global context, we also have to realize that the EU actually might not be the biggest player, the game changer in this context anymore. Our demand for energy is estimated to remain relatively stable, but other parts of the world are increasing. Their demand for energy will increase in the future. Particularly, we have here China and the rest of the world. So many emerging economies will actually need more and more energy, which obviously has implications also for the EU, because we'll have more competition. Competition will get tougher. We don't necessarily have more own resources. So the global context of the EU's energy imports and the EU's energy demand might have quite some implications. If you look at non-gas or oil-related energy, renewable energy. That's something that the EU tries to promote. But I just put this slide to show that particularly China is also very much investing in renewables. So if we talk about energy and the global energy picture, we should not forget that that is also an area in which different players, not just the EU, are becoming active. And we all might have heard about the solar panel disputes with China. So this is also a very important area when we talk about energy governance and energy security. If we then look, so we've seen that the EU is dependent on imports of energy. If we now break down this this dependency into different countries, we see that for gas, we depend on Russia as a source for 34% of our imports. So there you can already see the picture why the current Ukraine crisis is also very important with regard to our supplies of gas. For oil, the picture looks a bit different, but nonetheless, Russia supplies 33% of the EU's imports of crude oil. So here again, it's also a very important supplier. But one big difference that we should bear in mind is that gas is difficult to transport. Where there are now technologies, and they're increasingly used to make gas liquid, to use liquefied natural gas and to ship it with boats, and then construct big terminals where we can then convert this LNG, liquefied natural gas, into gas again. But this is very costly, and this is a relatively new development, while oil is, of course, easier to transport, or has been transported for a much longer time. To give you a bit of the EU internal picture, I just put a graph here to show that not all countries are equally dependent on gas imports. There's Denmark and the Netherlands that are not at all. But actually, if you look at the big bulk of EU member states, most of them are dependent on gas imports to 100%. And if you see some countries above 100%, that's because they filled up some of their resources. And there you see, of course, that Russia might have a big leverage if they supply 34% of our gas. And if many of these countries that we see on this slide are very dependent on imports, there's a very nice foreign policy tool for Russia. Since you just saw, the EU is receiving a third of its gas and also oil supplies from Russia. And since the latest events in Ukraine, for example, also showed that the security of the EU's energy supply from Russia and possibly also some other countries is not necessarily very secure, the EU actually has not been ignorant and has addressed some of these problems for some time. So not just now, it didn't wake up a few weeks ago, but it already has some policies in place which were adopted a few years ago. And one main element of the EU's security of energy supplies policy is actually that it has built up a strategic oil stocks. There's a directive from 2009 which actually imposed an obligation on EU member states to maintain a minimum stock of crude oil or petroleum products. In addition to that, it also addresses the gas problem, or the security of gas supplies, I should better say. There are various points or various initiatives that were taken and that certainly still have very high importance. One of them is, and I'll get back to that in a few slides, is building pipelines. Building pipelines, gas pipelines that pump gas from other sources than Russia to the EU, namely from the Caspian region. And I'll have some maps looking and discussing some of these pipeline projects. Then there's also a regulation from 2010 that concerns measures to safeguard the security of gas supplies, and that includes preventive action plans, emergency plans, and also capacity building infrastructure, and looking into bidirectional capacity. So far, gas flew mainly from the east to the west, but now we saw that some of the countries at the eastern side of the European Union might actually have to be supplied by gas from its western co-member states. So actually, infrastructure changes are being planned and implemented to change the flow of the direction of the flow of gas from west to east if needed. And there's a gas coordination group which facilitates coordination of security of supply measures. And then the third big point is electricity, and that again links to some infrastructure investments, looking into how to build up sufficient transmission and storage infrastructure so that we become less reliant on imports from outside of the EU, that we develop maybe some more domestic renewable sources, and that we can cope and transport them to the points where they're needed. But if you look at the imports that we still are dependent on to quite a significant part of our energy need, how does the oil or how does the gas, and in the lecture we focused more on gas because that is an interesting case, particularly with the current situation. So how does the gas get to Europe? And basically we have two options. One, or both of them were already mentioned. One is gas pipelines, and I've put a photo here. So we can build pipelines from countries in the east that produce the gas and pump it into the European Union. And the other one is we can liquefy it. We can build terminals in the producer countries that turn gas into liquefied gas, and then we can build terminals in the European Union that turn it back. That's significant investments. And until recently, that was not necessarily economical to do that, but increasingly, with the changing geopolitical situation, that is an option that many more countries look into, and a number of terminals are being built or have been built in recent years. And also with the shale gas developments, to which I'll get in a second, this becomes a potential future solution as well. As I said, the pipelines are very important, and especially if we look at the eastern neighborhood, which Svetlana also mentioned very much. We have one pipeline that we built in recently, and that has started operating and pumping gas. But if you look at the map already, where does this gas come from? From Russia. So this does not necessarily help us to get more independent of Russian gas supplies, because actually it pumps gas under the Baltic Sea from Russia into Germany, bypassing Poland, which was quite a political topic, or a politically sensitive topic at the time as well. Then there's this, in the pendant to the Nord Stream, the South Stream pipeline, yet again pumping gas from Russia. So here you see all this talk about gas or gas supply independence. It might be questionable in some cases. And you also might not be very surprised if I say that the South Stream actually is very much Gazprom sponsored. So the Russian state-owned gas company actually is financing this project to a large extent. And just recently with the Ukrainian crisis, the European Parliament actually called for stopping this project, which is meant to be, the building is meant to start just next month, so in June 2014. But some other countries, such as Bulgaria, are advocating the continuing of this project, and I guess the map already tells you why. The big intent of this South Stream was actually to, you could say, prevent another project, and that's the Nabucco Pipeline project, which I've got on this map here, which actually by now has been abandoned. So this was an idea very much favored by the United States and also very much supported by the European Union. And as I told you this earlier, this South Stream pipeline actually is very much Russian Gazprom supported and financed. So by investing into this South Stream pipeline, it was allegedly a Russian plan to prevent this Nabucco pipeline, which we see here on this map. And the idea from this map, you can tell already, is to pump gas from the Caspian region, so not from Russia into the European Union, into Austria. So this actually was a big project to change the sources of European gas supply, to diversify the sources of European gas supply, and to get less reliant on Russia. And for these reasons, of course, it was very much supported by the United States and by Europe. But as I said, recently this Nabucco pipeline was abandoned because mainly an Azerbaijani investor has decided that they would rather invest in this one, in the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline, still pumping gas from the Caspian into the European Union, but via a different route, as you can see here, through Greece, Albania, and Italy. So obviously this was a blow to Bulgaria and Hungary, and it would not necessarily help these countries that are very reliant on the Russian gas, or not as directly as the Nabucco one would have done so. And here you can already see the geopolitics, and you can already guess why the Azerbaijani investor might have chosen rather for this Trans-Adriatic pipeline as opposed to the Nabucco pipeline, because they obviously wanted to please their Russian partners as well as their European partners. And this Trans-Adriatic pipeline was a bit more, less controversial from the Russian side. So basically rushing through all this pipeline discussion, but there's actually a lot of politics going on here, and we discussed that a bit more in class. And it's definitely an issue to look more into if you're interested in that. Something that recently was put more on the agenda again, is, this looks a bit funny. This is just a copy paste from a recent Financial Times article, and it is written by the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who, faced with the crisis in Ukraine, with a threat by Russia to use its leverage in the form of gas supplies, and Mr. Tusk very much calls for a European energy union. Ideas, that's not a new idea. It already was on the table. The European Union as such was about energy in its early years. Coal and steel, really the origins of the EU, was about very related topics. So here again, we might potentially see a new political impetus for integration, European integration in the area of energy policy, given this new or newly perceived threat in the form of Russia, or Russia's supply of gas and oil to the European Union. So this as well is a very recent, very interesting political development that would be very interesting to follow. Leaving a bit the pipelines and moving quickly to another topic that is very recent and very topical, and that's I highlighted just one of the quotes of Mr. Tusk. So where he says, "I therefore propose an energy union. I will return the European project to its roots." Sorry, I forgot the circle. So moving to another very important energy-related topic, and that's shale gas, which basically is gas trapped in shale formations and different rock formations, and through new technology. And this graph shows it in a simplified form. So basically by pumping water with some chemicals into the ground, drilling horizontally, we can dissolve gas and heavy oil and various energy sources that is trapped in these rock and shale formations, and extract it and use these new sources of energy, mainly gas and oil. And that actually has changed the geopolitical situation with regard to energy, or the energy geopolitics, if you will. And for example, the mostly known case or change where shale gas actually really has had an impact already is North America. The United States has already started to extract more and more shale gas. People talk about the US becoming energy, or at least gas independent, turning from an importer to an exporter. This combined with this technology that I mentioned earlier, the liquefied natural gas, the US might actually be able to ship its gas to Europe, to Asia, to many of these different countries that I also showed earlier that have an increasing need of energy. So here actually the role and also the interests of the US might potentially change or have changed already. And this could also have big implications for the role of the US in the Middle East or in some other countries. But of course, this also is speculation, and you can wonder to what extent that really would change US foreign policy. I just have a slide here that shows the projection of the share of shale gas in the US's energy mix, and you can see it actually does, or it potentially will play a big role. But having said that, it's not necessarily the case for Europe as well. So we talked about the US. And so you could really wonder, what's the geopolitics of shale gas? Is it going to change much more beyond just the United States? And this table here shows you the gas reserves, the shale gas reserves and resources that are expected. And the interesting aspect of this table is, for example, China. So you can actually see China is potentially in the possession of quite a large shale gas resource in various areas, and potentially could also have more domestic sources of energy, because by now China has become quite import dependent as well. But that comes with different problems. For example, water. The technology that the US uses a lot requires a lot of water, and the areas where China has its shale gas resources, it does not have many water resources, so it might actually need different technologies if it was to exploit these shale gas resources. So China has not really started doing that yet, but there is some potential, and you can look at different other countries. You don't only see your classical oil or gas exporting countries, there are also some others that might enter the scene and become more of an exporting nation than they were before. But this is a lot of speculation, and you can't really analyze yet what the exact implications will be, but potentially there will be some changes. And here, this is just a bit of a change map, where you see already the resources that have been proven, and there are many gray areas still where we just don't know yet what the resources are. Good. This was rushing through many different aspects of energy security policy globally and in the EU and Europe as such in particular. I just have a few slides summarizing some of the elements with regard to the security implication of climate change. This is in parts linked to energy, but much broader, and also a bit of a different security threat. When you look at climate security, you see actually quite some activity in the end of the first 10 years of the 2000s. So in 2009, we actually have the UN General Assembly calling climate change a threat multiplier. And so there's a report that talks about different ways in which climate change actually can multiply and aggravate certain threats. And not only the UN, but also the European Union actually has taken this issue very seriously and has adopted more than one publication on this issue and has taken some initiative. So, and if we go through the different points of how climate change can actually be a threat to the security of the Europeans or globally, you can first of all anticipate that with droughts, with floods, with changing climates, the availability of resources might change, and some resources might become more scarce. And that could, of course, multiply some conflicts that exist already, or actually help them, well, to get over the tipping point to actually escalate. So if water becomes scarcer and scarcer, conflicts might become aggravated. Another important aspect is, of course, the economic damage and the risk that coastal cities in particular face with rising sea levels, for example, or floods. Then related to that as well, losses of territory due to rising sea levels, desertification, and other climate change related events can, of course, trigger border disputes, disputes over land. And that can, of course, link to migration. It is always difficult to really link migration flows to climate change or to environmental triggers only, but you could argue and you could anticipate that it becomes more important in the future, that if resources get very scarce, that will contribute to migration. As we saw earlier already, the UN calls it a multiplier, not necessarily a cause as such, but clearly an issue that can change a certain developments that are there already. Yeah, radicalization, of course, is also an issue. And then we have again the energy supply. If water becomes more scarce, hydropower, for example, it becomes less efficient. So there's also a link to energy here. And that, of course, puts a big pressure on international governance. So actually, we should prepare for some of these events, and we should already take them and anticipate them and take them into account. And so that's why I just have, this is my last slide, 2 quotes on this slide. And they both are from 2008, from a publication by the EU High Representative together with the European Commission. And this is really about what kind of role can the European Union play in this context of climate change being a security threat multiplier. And here it is stated very clearly that the EU actually is in a unique position to respond to some of these impact of climate change on international security through its leading role that it plays already in development aid, in global climate policies, and taking all its different tools and instruments that it has at its disposal already. So here there clearly is some thinking in this direction. And then the second quote also very much links to that, saying that the EU already has a comprehensive approach to conflict prevention, crisis management, and post-conflict reconstruction. So here again, we can actually play a quite unique role as Europeans in trying to prevent, but also trying to help in cases of climate-induced or climate conflicts to which climate also contributed and multiplied the threats. Okay, this again was rushing through some of the key aspects, and that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email.
All right, so hello again. So over the next 12 to 15 minutes, I'm going to try and summarize some of the main points that I made during the last lecture on Europe's futures, where we looked at Europe from a geopolitical perspective, and in particular, we looked at how the U.S. factor, how strategic calculations on the part of Washington affected the process of European integration and the evolution of European geopolitics more broadly, both from a historical perspective, but also from a contemporary perspective. And my central message was that the United States has been the one decisive factor in European geopolitics since World War II, and that strategic decisions made in Washington have framed the environment within which the European integration process emerged and developed, both during the Cold War and post-Cold War periods. And as a result of this, America's current geostrategic reorientation towards the Asia-Pacific region, away from Europe that is having deep transformative effects upon European geopolitics that are very much likely to affect the nature and evolution of the European integration process. And remember that we discussed that the Ukraine crisis was likely to slightly alter Washington's calculation vis-a-vis Europe in terms of particularly defense policy and force posture and defense strategy, but only slightly so. All right, so let's then get started. Let me change the slide. All right. Okay. So as it couldn't be otherwise, given its pivotal position in post-war European geopolitics, the U.S. played a critical role in the birth of European integration. As the Cold War emerged in the late 1940s, the United States and also the United Kingdom, who was an important key player at the time, believed that the unification of West Germany, its reindustrialization and its remilitarization were crucial if the Western effort to contain Soviet power in Central Europe was to be successful. And by the remilitarization of West Germany, I mean the consolidation of the British, French, and American sectors into one. Remember that West Germany, not only was Germany divided into East and West Germany after World War II, but also West Germany was itself divided into three administrative sectors. Now, for a number of reasons, the French actually opposed the American ideas and British ideas aimed at the consolidation of West Germany, but couldn't, however, resist the process. So it was in this context, in an environment where France's choices were constrained by the strategic decisions made by Washington and London, that the French came up with the 1949 Schuman Plan, which kick-started the whole European integration process. And the 1949 Schuman Plan, as I was mentioning in the lecture, was a pragmatic and effective solution to French concerns about German power. And that's what the Schuman Plan was mostly about. The Schuman Plan came out of a position paper drafted in the French Foreign Ministry, in the planning unit of the French Foreign Ministry. And the idea was that under the European Coal and Steel Community, West Germany would surrender control over the industries of the Ruhr Valley that had allowed Germany, that is, to outperform and overrun France twice in the 20th century, in the early 20th century. So, and if European integration was the first caveat to West Germany's remilitarization and reindustrialization, integration within NATO's military structure was the second one. So we need to bear in mind the importance of the fact that throughout the entire Cold War period, West Germany lacked an independent command and control infrastructure, and that the German armed forces, the West German armed forces, that is, were completely under U.S. command via NATO. So we sort of had a situation where the German industry was not under French command, but certainly under French supervision via the European Coal and Steel Community, and where the West German military was under U.S. command. So you can see that the building blocks, the industrial and military blocks of German power, were under heavy Western supervision through NATO and the European community. So I think we can say that that NATO and the European community were two different instruments at the service of the same geopolitical vision and geopolitical blueprint, which was to keep West Germany down and on a leash geopolitically, and secondly, and progressively more and more important, to keep the Russians out of Western Europe and to maintain a balance of power in Central Europe. And I think it's important to bear in mind that the security of Western Europe against the Soviet Union depended not only upon territorial defense, but also upon political stability and economic development in Western Europe. And this is where the EC sort of tied in with the whole NATO system and with the broader Western geostrategy in Europe. I think the assumption of a heavy interdependence among the military, political, and socioeconomic aspects of security was central to U.S. post-war strategy in Europe. Okay, so now as we discussed during the lecture last week, the collapse of the Soviet Union led many IR scholars and pundits, particularly in the United States, to assume that the U.S. will shift its geostrategic attention away from Europe. And there were indeed very significant troop reductions, reductions of American troops in Europe, that is. In fact, in 1990, the U.S. had 290,000 military personnel in Europe, and there are less than 80,000 today. But despite that fact, the post-Cold War period was actually characterized by important geostrategic continuities that kept the United States very much tied to developments on the European continent. In fact, I would say that that throughout the 1990s, the U.S. and not least through NATO continued to play a pivotal role, a pivotal position in the European international system. And I think this is clearly illustrated by the fact that the U.S. played the leading role in the most significant developments of post-Cold War Europe, namely the process of German reunification, the enlargement of NATO, and by association the EU, because we need to bear in mind that the whole enlargement debate first took place in a NATO setting, and the enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe, that is, and the third sort of big development that the Americans played a key role in was although in terms that were not fully satisfactory to Western Europeans, was the stabilization of the Western Balkans and the remaking of the geopolitical map of the Western Balkans. And these three developments, German reunification, Eastern enlargement, and the stabilization of the Western Balkans, would actually take up all of the bandwidth of the European Union throughout the 1990s and throughout the previous decade. So we have a situation whereby strategic decisions made in Washington, greatly conditioned, it sort of set the context that sort of determined the evolution of the nature and evolution of the European integration process. Moving on. Now, I think this sort of picture that I'm sketching changed slightly from the early 2000s, because I think, animated by the events of September the 11th, by the terrorist attacks in New York City and Washington, the United States started to pull its military, its political and its strategic attention away from Europe onto Afghanistan and Iraq, and precisely at a time when Europe's sort of post-war bargain Western order was expanding onto Central, Eastern, Southeastern Europe, and even the Southern Mediterranean and the Levant through several political initiatives on the part of NATO and the European Union. And I think this was very interesting because the combination of a more stable environment in Central and Eastern Europe and of America's weakening presence in the European continent multiplied substantially Germany's possibilities and strategic freedom of maneuver. And this actually represented a qualitative change in the mechanics of the European integration process, which until then had been defined by a Franco-German axis where Germany's strategic dependence on the United States, caused by its security vulnerabilities in the East, translated into French political and strategic leadership in the EC, in the EU. And but the fact that the US was pulling away from Europe and that Central and Eastern Europe was stabilized changed this and gave Germany more political confidence in the framework of European integration. So, I mean, contrary to what many people argue, I wouldn't say that it was the Euro crisis, that the recent European financial and economic crisis that sort of inaugurated German, that sort of signaled Germany's emerging leadership in the European community. That was probably a manifestation of that leadership. But I think the structural roots of Germany's improving position within the European Union go way back, and particularly to Eastern enlargement and to America's weakening position in the European continent. In addition to this, to having reinforced Germany's position, I think the U.S.'s waning presence in Western Europe and in Central Europe gave Russia and in particular additional breathing space in Eastern Europe and also to some extent in Southeastern Europe. And I think over the last, I mean, if this was sort of a result of the war on terror paradigm and the subsequent shift in U.S. strategic priorities onto Central Asia and the broader Middle East, I think over the last few years, financial, political, and military fatigue in the United States and the strategic rise of China have further compounded the U.S. geostrategic shift towards Asia or further away from Europe. And I think this whole process is giving way to an opening of the balance of power in Europe and the broader European neighborhood, I mean, whose political order had been defined for many, many decades by U.S. military hegemony, or had been underpinned by U.S. military hegemony. So now the key question that we sort of tried to tackle during the lecture was, how is the vacuum left by America's geostrategic downsizing from the broader European neighborhood being filled, right? And then we remember that we talked about three main geostrategic dynamics that are filling a great deal of the vacuum left by the U.S. downsizing. Remember that it's not that the U.S. is not leaving, it's not abandoning Europe, but it's certainly downsized in Europe. And there are three main geostrategic dynamics that are filling a great deal of the vacuum left in and around Europe. And these three are the emerging strategic alliance or entente between the United Kingdom and France. Then, on the other hand, a German-led and German-French-led project on European economic of European economic and political integration, and Russia's resurgence across Eastern Europe, which of course has been very eloquently illustrated by the recent developments in Ukraine. And I think, of course, these three dynamics, or these three geostrategic trends, however you want to call them, they manifest themselves differently in the sense that the different powers that lead each of those dynamics lean on different instruments and also have different geographical areas of priority, although they overlap on some of those areas. And of course, these three dynamics are not always clear cut, and they often overlap with each other, because we are, after all, in a period of tectonic change in Europe, where everything is very much in flux. And so during the lecture, we sort of discussed the main geographical or geostrategic vectors of each one of those three dynamics, and the main instruments that the main powers resort to in order to advance their political influence, which may vary widely from one country to another. For instance, we said that Germany's main assets are its economic and trade power and its institutional power in the framework of the EU, whereas the French and the British lean more on military power, and the Russians use a combination of military power and their energy leverage to boost their political influence in some European countries. But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that, because we don't have time to get into the specific of each one of these geostrategic dynamics. So I think I'll leave it at that.